A few words from Paul's letter to the congregation in Rome, the first chapter. What can be known about God is perfectly plain to human beings, since God has made it plain to them ever since the creation of the world. The invisible existence of God and his everlasting power have been clearly seen by the mind's understanding of created things. So people have no excuse. They knew God, yet they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but their arguments became futile and their uncomprehending minds were darkened. They exchanged God's truth for a lie and have worshipped and served the creature instead of the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. I have faith, help my lack of faith. I expect that expresses the experience of most any adult down through time. Clearly, real vital faith has never come easy, except perhaps for children, and that's why it's fun to hang around them. They have no trouble whatever believing in a world beyond this one. Read Susie Kiphart's new little book called Loving Well. Last Easter, she told the children in chapel that long ago, some people did not love Jesus, and that's why they crucified him. And one little girl looked up at her and asked, "But do they love him now?" Sooner or later, though, the troubles do descend, and faith becomes more of a struggle, especially, I think, in the modern era. Of course, there's still a lot of it around. 9 of 10 of us believe in God. But the real question for us is more about the quality of our faith rather than the quantity. We believe, but we've become reticent about our belief. How much passion and commitment is there in us? I have faith. How many can say that with vigor and conviction? And of course, there's some good reasons for the reticence. For one thing, a strong strain of psychology, and we are a psychologized culture if ever there was one. A strong strain of psychology beginning with Feuerbach and Freud suggested that Jesus is pretty much the projection of our own inner wishes and needs. I do run into this suspicion from time to time. Young people who've never heard of those two fellows will say to me something like, "Well, do you suppose, Pastor, we may have invented him?" Of course, it's a good way to try to get under my skin. But I do run into adults whose faith is a bit hesitant because of this rather widespread point of view. From this perspective, popular with intellectual and cultural elites, faith is little more than a superstitious hangover for enlightened minds who cling, for obvious psychological reasons, to the need for comfort and security in a cold and uncaring universe. And further, there is abroad in the academy a commitment to naturalistic materialism, which calls into question rather vigorously any notion of a God. For example, there's Harvard paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson, who declares, "It is evident that all the objective phenomena of history of life can be explained by purely naturalistic and materialistic factors. Man, it is clear, is the result of a purposeless and natural process that did not have him in mind." Now, I hate to grant much importance to these threats, let alone talk to them very much, except for the fact that we send our kids off into academic environments where they will hear this stuff. And also the media elite and the chattering classes are heavily infected with the same attitudes. So there are strong cultural forces which continually threaten to erode our seriousness about God and all that faith involves. And further, I suspect that the very nature of life in the modern urban world tends to diminish the sense of God's reality and importance, tends to make God less and less an urgency, less a matter of deep-seated conviction. Life today in a secular, bureaucratic society, so highly scheduled, so frenetic, we easily neglect the quiet and worship necessary for religious devotion. And furthermore, in this modern world, we're forced to deal day in and day out with such apparently secular problems that we lose all sense of where God fits in. He disappears into the voices and noises of a world seemingly empty of him. Very few read the daily headlines asking where God might be present to the current dilemmas we face. It may help to tell you that I once lost my faith in God. I mean thoroughly and completely. And while studying at one of the most religious colleges in the country, the question of his reality, his existence, became a problem I simply could not overcome. I literally drowned in doubt. And for somebody already committed to the ministry, this represented a fairly significant problem, as you can imagine. I have neither the time nor would it be appropriate here to tell the story of how I found my way back to faith again. Let me only say that it was not through an intellectual process whereby I, in the solitary of my own thoughts, utilizing all my brilliant intellectual powers, convinced myself by reason or proof that God was indeed there for me. Rather, in time, I came to appreciate and accept a more ancient judgment about faith in God, a vital sense that He's really and truly counts. It is not an intellectual problem. Like many in modern secular society, I had come to assume that God was the problem when it came to believing. He's so hidden and obscure, so difficult to understand. Where's the evidence? How can I be sure? I mean, after all, haven't you ever wondered on occasion whether He's really there? In time, I began to take Jesus and Paul seriously enough to listen to what they had to say about both faith and doubt. And clearly for them, God is not the problem at all. We are. Paul insists that we all know God, not in the way the scientist knows, but in fact, in a deeper and inner certainty. From creation and conscience, we know He's there. With Immanuel Kant, we look out at the starry heavens and to the moral law within us, and we know that He's real. Every human being that walks the face of this earth knows at some deep level of his being that there is God. The problem, though, is that we're not neutral about that knowledge. To embrace Him as our God means again and again to submit ourselves to a will higher than our own. Because God is, think about it, almost by definition, not just Uncle Charlie or our stockbroker that we can take or leave. As God, He's the creator and giver of our life, whose will we are here to serve. So to acknowledge and serve God often interferes with the way we have things planned, robs us of our desired autonomy, destroys our freedom to choose the way we want to go, to decide and live as we find most expedient and self-serving. I mean, think about what seriousness of God really means. It means putting His will above our hobbies, our ambitions, our self-fulfillment, our impulses. What I'm saying is this: our doubts are rarely intellectually honest. They are very often self-serving. Even though we possess the capacity for faith in God, we have a bias against it in some little part of us because it's hard on our ego, it's restricting of our own desires. It continually calls for some real changes in our program. It calls for considerable risk. So in any way, I began to question the integrity of my doubts. I began to see that they might very well have their roots in something other than honest, objective, intellectual inquiry. They might more likely have been rooted in my youthful desire to be let alone. Before he died, the late philosopher Mortimer Adler, well known down to the University of Chicago, before he died, he made a wholehearted commitment to the Christian God. But back in his autobiography, I find this, before he made that commitment. To become seriously religious would clearly require a radical change in my way of life, a basic alteration in the direction of day-to-day choices, as well as in the ultimate objectives that I sought and hoped for. So the simple truth of the matter is, I did not wish to live up to being a genuinely religious person. Much of the talk in the academy about the irrelevance of God is due not to scientific objectivity at all, but to a prior commitment to the comfort of a materialist view of reality. Philosopher and scientist Thomas Nagel, in A Moment of Candor, speaks of his fear of religion and writes, "I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that." Which leads to the interesting conclusion that much of our doubt is less a problem of objective inquiry and intellectual difficulty than it is a bias toward not having to deal. Paul Witz, professor of psychology at New York University, was an atheist until in his late 30s. He earned his bachelor's degree at the University of Michigan, his doctorate at Stanford. In a recent interesting little study of the most notable atheists of our time, such as Feuerbach, Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Jean-Paul Sartre, Sigmund Freud, H.G. Wells, Madeleine Murray O'Hair, I bet you know at least the last one, and a dozen others, he comes to this conclusion. Despite its pretensions to cool-headed rationality, modern atheism originated in the irrational, often neurotic psychological needs of a few powerfully influential thinkers. Russell Baker, for example, well-known journalist and humorist for the New York Times, marvelous writer, but also an unbeliever. In his autobiography, he tells how when he was 5 years old, his father was suddenly taken to the hospital and died there. Russell, weeping, spoke to the family housekeeper, Bessie. "For the first time, I thought seriously about God. Between sobs, I told Bessie that if God could do things like this to people, then God was hateful and I had no more use for him. If God loves me, why did he make my father die?" Bessie said she hoped he would understand someday, but she was not right. That afternoon, though I could not have phrased it this way then, I decided that God was a lot less interested in people than anybody in Morrisonville was willing to admit. That day, I decided that God was not entirely to be trusted. After that day, I never cried again with any conviction, nor expected much of anyone's God except indifference, nor loved deeply without fear that it would cost me dearly in pain. At the age of 5, I had become a skeptic, and I've stayed that way. Now, one can understand with sympathy and even agony a 5-year-old in that situation. But to remain stuck as a 5-year-old when you're 50, it seems to me, is something else again. Our story insists that God does come readily and powerfully to the courage, the adult, mature courage to trust. It's a fascinating story. An unnamed man brings his son, an epileptic, to the disciples. They're unable to help. Jesus appears on the scene, and how does he react? With understanding and sympathy? Of course, it was difficult for you to do anything. After all, you're only human, and God can be very difficult to corner. Not at all. It's rather interesting to hear Jesus being feisty. Jesus sounds angry and upset, talks as if the problem lay not with them at all, with God at all. "O faithless generation, how much longer do I have to put up with you?" But the Father persists, will not give up. "If you're able, have pity on us, help us." And again, his response is surprising and unexpected. "Sure, I'll help you, I'll be glad to." Not at all. Jesus turns the man's appeal back on him. If you are able, if you are willing, all things can be done for the one who believes. And immediately the Father cries in desperation, "I have faith, help my lack of faith." You see, the power and presence of God is never real to the neutral, to the observer, to the casual inquirer, to those who would like some evidence before giving up autonomy and independence, to those who want to know about God without knowing him as their God. God is not a problem, friends, of intellect or emotional mood. God is a problem of our will. God makes himself real only to the courage of faith against the despair of doubt, only to the willingness to trust against the inclination to go it alone. Jesus is clear. Faith is the capacity we all have to turn against the enticement of our doubts and make the brave surrender to his will and power. In a way, faith is a little more like marriage than it is like mathematics. Over the years, there have been occasions when there has been, late on a Friday night, a phone call or even a knock on the door, and there has stood a nervous, sweaty groom who's come to me with one question: how can I know that what I'm doing tomorrow is the right thing? How can I answer? All I know to say is show up tomorrow and go through it and you'll find out. And it's rather that way with God. If you're able, willing, all things can be done for the one who believes. God becomes real only to the courage of faith, the willingness to risk it, a faith of which we're all capable when we turn our back on the lure of our doubts and trust the God that we deep down inside know is there. And the second word of this story is this: the courage comes in the right company. We sustain the courage of faith in the company of Him who calls for it, and we find Him most often among His people. Put another way, isolation always breeds despair and doubt. Community of faith feeds faith, sustains faith. Together we confirm and sustain in one another the embrace of faith in God. I think one of the more stirring examples I know of this is the story of Terry Anderson, who you remember was captive for 6 years in a dark cell in Beirut, Lebanon, often chained, captors brutal, tortured him physically, mentally. How did he respond? He said to reporters when he arrived in Damascus after liberation, "There were periods when I felt like giving up, overwhelmed with despair at the suffering and hopelessness of my condition. But I refused to doubt. The first book I was allowed was a Bible, and I devoured it. In conversation with fellow captives, I began to regain the faith of my youth. When asked what kept him going, in sum, he says, the people who were with me, my faith, and my stubbornness." Faith is stubborn, courageous. So courage, company, and finally confirmation, that is there in this story as well. The courage of faith is always rewarded with confirmation. Two things impress themselves upon me the longer I live. On the one hand, the misery and meanness that most often accompanies the way of doubt. One of the atheists in Dr. Witt's study, Jean-Paul Sartre, once toast to the philosophes of Paris and seducer of many a young American mind, ends up his life withdrawn, petty, absorbed in his own inconvenience. On the other hand, the strength and beauty and wholeness that accompanies the courage of faith, I never find that faith disappointed. I've never heard anyone say, I really tried, I gave myself to his love and service, and he left me empty. Against the prejudice of many secular scientists, research upon research now demonstrates that men and women of serious faith enjoy greater emotional and physical health, a higher sense of well-being, greater sensitivity to and care for others than those without such faith. In other words, the reality of the God of faith is confirmed by the fact that faith in Him really does work health, work love, work life. I think back to the story of Lin Yutang, degrees from Harvard and the University of Berlin, professor of English at Beijing University, editor of several Asian journals, chancellor of Nanyang University in Singapore, head of the Arts and Letters Division of UNESCO in New York City. Many years ago, he wrote a piece in which he identified himself publicly as an agnostic. He wrote that Christian theology repelled him as presumptuous and unscientific arrogance. But over time, his agnosticism left him feeling empty. He could finally write, "In some desperation, I turned to the awe-inspiring simplicity and beauty of the teachings of Jesus, and the scales began to fall from my eyes. Jesus spoke of God the Father as one who knew Him in the fullness of love. It's astounding, too, that God, as Jesus revealed Him, is so different from what men thought Him to be. There's a totally different order of love and compassion. I know, of course, the teaching that God is love and the consequent compulsion to make ours a better world will be derided and scoffed at by the materialists of our generation, who believe that the world is only a whirl of blind atoms obeying blind mechanical laws. And such a gospel must be despised and feared by all who preach hatred and violence. But I really do not know of anything, certainly not humanism, which will deter man from hatred and violence and cunning and deceit, except these very compulsions of Christian faith. The conflict between a godless society and one in which God has allowed room in the hearts of people is elementary. So I no longer ask, is there a satisfying religion for the modern educated man? I know there is. Returning to the Bible, I found there an authentic revelation that brings God through Christ within my reach. I've returned to the church. I'm happy in my accustomed pew on Sunday morning. I believe we all go to church because we're conscious of our spiritual heritage, but equally conscious of our human failings and the self-complacency into which we so easily fall without help from this greater power and one another. He who would reach out to see the beauty and soul-charging power of the teachings of Jesus must often struggle, I admit, against the religious claptrap that seems to come along with him. But this Jesus, this person and his gospel, I have found sufficient, a sufficiency which is joyously renewed each day. Looking back on my life, I know that for 30 years I lived in the world like an orphan. I am an orphan no longer. I have come home. Everything is possible for the one who has faith. I have faith. Help my lack of faith. My prayer for you as well.